With us this morning, we have Dr. Al Benson from Northwestern, Dr. Bill Dalton from Moffitt, Gwen Darien from the Pathways Project. We have Richard Gaynor from Eli Lilly, and Dr. Newcomer from UnitedHealthcare. So with that, we're going to just jump in because this morning's been so energetic. I'm actually really excited. I think about these things all the time. So the fact that I have this panel that I can torture for a little bit is exciting to me. So let's just jump in. I mean, we heard a lot of really, I think, optimistic and exciting things this morning about the evolution of personalized medicine and how we really are getting to that point that we can get the right treatment to the right patient at the right time. And it's exciting, but this is all happening at a time when we're really focused on our healthcare costs are just growing dramatically. Cancer therapies, the newest ones, are very expensive. And we're engaged in a really heated debate around how do we get the best value for the money we spend in oncology. And I know from where I come from with cost, we all have a good sense of what we mean by cost and how we measure it. But when it comes to value, I think we're still struggling. So Gwen, I want to start with you. How do you define value, particularly in cancer care?
Well, I'd actually like to step back a tiny bit and say, and look at, I wrote this note about 5 different times in 5 different ways on the sheet I can't read, but I think that one of the issues is we all talk about patient-centered, and everybody talks about putting the patient at the center, but I'm not sure we all know what that means, and I think if we ask everybody on the panel, we may have a slightly different definition. And I think the important thing to me, and I've sort of come to this point, is we used to spend a lot of time agreeing on a definition, but I think it's much more valuable to spend time thinking, having people define what they mean by this, and just understand what people mean, because I think it's fine to have multiple perspectives and multiple points of view, but we talk about the patient at the center all the time, and I'm often asked to give the patient perspective or talk about what that is, and I say I give a patient perspective, and hopefully I can relate what some of my friends and colleagues say. But sometimes I said this to you last night, sometimes I think of the patient as Flat Stanley, and I don't know if everybody remembers that, but there's a paper cutout that would travel around the world and people would take pictures of them. I did it for my nephew. And the patient isn't Flat Stanley. The patient is a multidimensional person with many, many differing values. And I think it really behooves us to understand those dimensions so that we can integrate that into our definition of value.
And what are some of those dimensions, if I can
Well,
push you?
I think, for example, last night I was reading Health Affairs. I was reading the issue on value. So there was one article about how patients define value, where it was talking about how patients would be very willing to accept a large risk profile of treatment. They'd be willing to say, okay, I'll try this if it'll give me a 50% chance of living 4 years, as opposed to I'll try this if it'll give me a 100% chance of living 2 years. And then in the same issue, there was a narrative medicine piece, a woman who had inflammatory breast cancer who decided to forego aggressive treatment and really focus on palliative care. So I think that there are people, I think that you can't make, I mean, I'm sorry to be, I feel like I'm not being as direct as you want, but at the same time, I think those are really specific examples of 2 very different approaches to what value might be. And so value is, we know value is in the eye of the beholder, but I think we have to understand what the potential parameters of value might be.
Bill, how do you translate that in the clinic? How do you deal with this type of variation in the sense of value amongst your patients?
Yeah, I think Gwen did frame it well. I think as a clinician, our first question, I believe, is need. What is the need of this patient? Obviously, we focus on therapeutic need, but if we're there to take care of the patient, remember, we don't take care of cancer, we take care of the patient who has cancer. Then there are going to be many different types of need. And I think the first step in that category, which hopefully creates value, is identify need. Identify all needs that you can at least have an impact on. Again, therapeutic need, especially in personalized medicine, and that's why we use another term called precision medicine, in understanding the molecular nuance, the phenotype, genotype, so that we can give the best therapy to the right patient at the right time. That's important, but it probably doesn't meet all the needs of a patient and maybe even their families. So I think as a clinician, our perspective is identify need, develop a means hopefully to meet those needs, and then thirdly, develop a system, which is I think one of the reasons we're all here, is that you could predict need before it manifests, which is markers. We use markers in precision medicine, but there are many different types of markers that may predict psychosocial need, for example, that might occur. So to be truly effective and hopefully create value is we develop a system that will predict need, be it through generation of markers, so that we could actually intervene before the need manifests. So I would frame the discussion around need.
Al, can you take that and help us understand a little bit about when we're evaluating need, how do you fit in what we know about treatments at a given time? Most of what we're learning about treatments is that they provide some type of survival, or they have a certain toxicity profile. How do you work with that information, along with your assessment of patient need?
Well, I think what we're taught as clinicians is when we're in the office, we're one-on-one with the patient, and the focus is on that individual. And how do we look at all the parameters affecting that individual patient, whether it's financial or family, what insurance plan they may have, what are their perceptions of risk, what do they expect in terms of benefit. But I think part of the struggle we face is, although we are taught to work with the individual, in the larger context, we're a society that tremendously values individual rights. And I think we're experiencing the tension of what might be appropriate or meet the needs of the individual with what can society bear. I think some of this comes to light when we have DNR discussions, because we hear endlessly about the high cost of end-of-life care and inappropriate, perhaps, medical interventions that in the end will not provide benefit for the patient. And that's where we get into what the individual desires and what we may as clinicians and as society say, giving someone chemotherapy the last day of life makes no sense on so many different levels. And I think this is going to be an enormous educational challenge to balance the value of the individual and all that surrounds that, as I mentioned, the expectations and the life forces that affect that individual, and what is really appropriate medical intervention. I would also say, though, and I think John Mendelson's talk provided the perspective of the transformation, certainly of oncology, where we have traditionally designed trials for populations of patients, looking at a more global situation. Well, we're moving way away from that, back to the individual. So integrating therapy based on the complexities of the individual's tumor rather than a broad population. And this is going to have many ramifications, not only how we treat an individual patient, what we're required to give the best treatment, but also how we look at databases, comparative effectiveness, how we design clinical trials with the focus on the tremendous nuances of individual patients' tumors.
I so appreciate that everyone's effort to really keep this, it's very broad, and I think we can all relate to these ideas of really wanting to keep it very individual. But I'm gonna push you, Lee. How do you deal with that as a payer? How do you?
So nobody else gets to answer and I have.
Absolutely. But you can punt back. Go ahead and push. It's okay.
Well, I'm sitting here doing the lower estimate
That's
score.
right.
I have context is so important to that question. Sunday night, I had a conversation with a father and his 25-year-old son. The son had just finished the Twin Cities Marathon last fall. Didn't recover real well the next day and went in and was found to have stage 4 colon cancer, of all things, at age 25. And so he went through a course of therapy and failed it within a month. And the discussion on Sunday night was, well, what clinical trial would be best? And as I got 20 minutes into this discussion, it became apparent that they were still thinking they were curable. And so when I said to this young man, look, let's talk about what you're going to get from whatever treatment you choose. We're talking about extending life, but we are not going to cure you here. Every value changed. Okay? Suddenly, he was no longer interested in getting in the trial next Monday. He was going to go out on a canoe trip and then enroll 3 weeks later. His whole priority and value system changed. And that context is critical. What we're not talking about on this panel is the cost part of that context.
Oh, we can talk about that.
We're going to. We're going to. And one of the values here, if we're going to have a value discussion about therapy, I think you're going to have to do that on a society context where not only is the cancer patient present at the forum, but so is the pregnant mother, and so is the kid with cystic fibrosis. Okay? Because I have to deal with a structure that isn't individualized. I have to talk about how do we provide coverage for an entire population, and to do that in a fair way, we kind of have to set boundaries that apply to all people, and then they have to take their value equation underneath that. And so it's not as though I can say to someone, gee, your cancer is worth $500,000 and your cancer is worth $100,000. We have to say, here's what we cover, here's what we don't cover, and then you can have your other value discussions underneath that. That needs a society discussion. Now, the Brits did this years ago and said that if it costs more than $40,000 for a year of life, we just can't afford it. That'll never fly in the United States, but we need to have a conversation like that or we're in trouble. And let's just put that in very blunt context. 41 states this year will be in deficits because of their Medicaid bills. Okay? If you have a child under 5 or a grandchild, how many? Yeah, a bunch of this room. Well, by the time they get out of high school, they have to make the average U.S. salary to pay for their insurance premium. Forget food, clothing, shelter, and anything else. So it's unsustainable. What we are doing today cannot be maintained, and we will have to cut back. That's just arithmetic. And so we've got to have the discussion about what we can afford to pay.
I agree, and let's hold that for a little bit, and we will come back, because I totally agree with you. I want to continue on the value piece for a minute, because we really do have, this broad definition of value. But as we're going to make these decisions and we're going to think about it alongside cost, we're going to have to start to define a little bit more precisely what we're going to count as value, how we're going to put those pieces together. So Richard, I want to ask you, one of the things that I see as a struggle here is that when we're bringing new treatments to market and we're trying to measure some sense of value in the trials, we're very focused on some hardcore efficacy measures. Those don't always match up, maybe, with what's most important to patients. I know that we struggle to help our friends in pharma to get different types of patient-reported outcomes measures into trials. How does that work for you? What is that challenge and that struggle between what you need what data you need to collect to get approval and what data it is that people really are looking to get?
Well, a couple of points, I guess, I'd like to make. One, I think, the reason we do research is to really basically to solve problems. And I think with a lot of the genetic research that's ongoing now, I think we've gotten much better in really defining patient populations and who may benefit from different, therapies. And ultimately, the goal would be to reduce cost, because the most expensive treatment is to treat someone who'll get no benefit from your therapy. And, so the goal is ultimately to cure different types of cancers. We've done in some instances, but to make this, to do this on a larger basis. So that's the first thing. The second point I'd like to make, I think, what do we want and what do we see as value? I think the patient, the physician, and the payer would say meaningful increases in survival would be what we strive for, and that would be what values. That's what patients want, and I think we would be aligned on that. And the third thing, I guess, quality of life. We don't only want increased survival, and I think now quality of life measures are being incorporated into a lot of different trials and stuff. We want really basically clinical benefit, improved survival, and not at the cost of severe toxicity and stuff. So basically what you want to give the patient is meaningful amounts of time and meaningful quality of time. And I think, to John Mendelssohn's talk, as we're getting better at defining patient populations, either clinically, looking at different geographies, looking at both biochemical and genetic, I think the goal is while we can't afford everything, is get the right therapies to the right patients and do this in a way where you're going to give meaningful benefits and quality of life and increase in length of time on therapy.
So I think one of the things I'm just sitting up here squirming as well, because I think you are asking, we are confronting the most difficult question that I think that we confront in terms of the cancer community, which is what is the value of an individual life? And I think everybody's danced around this, but it's impossible to quantify that value. And I think that's why we're having so much trouble saying what it is. And I think one of the things that Lee said was to just be, what happened with that discussion was that you were really direct with those. You were really direct with that father and son. And people, doctors and patients and advocates and everybody in this community it's such a hard thing to say to somebody, you're not going to survive this. This is going to be, this is what will cause your death. And I think it just, you can see I can't even articulate a sentence that is a little more elegant sentence, because it's such an uncomfortable discussion. And I think we are in the midst of this very uncomfortable thinking about what value is. And so it's easier when we say what the value is we put a numerical value on how much chemotherapy costs, but this is really tough.
No, it is tough, and I had somebody give me an example a couple of years ago of somebody with very late-stage prostate cancer, and the gentleman simply wanted to stay alive long enough to attend his daughter's wedding.
Right.
That's value.
Right.
But how do we begin to grapple with that from, the standpoint of what we're going to pay for? I think you're correctly in the UK they've had this real this cutoff, and I think we can talk about that for a little bit, because if you read the discussion paper, some of the themes that come out of there, and if you think about the way it has happened in the UK, is they use a cutoff and it's a static model. They've analyzed the data at launch, product market entry.
Yeah.
So where do we go with that?
Yeah, I just like to make, a lot of, discoveries, at least, in pharmaceutical industry and in oncology in general, are incremental. We usually start with later stages of the disease to show a clear drug benefit. But then once you show that, you'll then move it up into earlier stages of disease. Remember when Herceptin started out and, everyone was, well, should we really use Herceptin? And then eventually it makes it into the adjuvant, therapy. And that's actually the rule. Gleevec and Herceptin and a variety of other drugs won't go through. So there's a whole process here. So one of the real questions is, when do you measure whether a drug is worth it? Do you measure when it gets launched? Do you measure after 5 to 7 years? And also the medical community is really good at testing drugs in different combinations, different schedules, combinability. And so the question is if you look right when a drug's launched, it might have what you quote unquote little value. If you look at quality adjusted life, whereas maybe, 5 to 7 years, it's curing patients in an adjuvant setting. So I think we need to be careful of point measures of what quality and what value is.
So here's a proposal for that, because you also said, ultimately we want big win drugs. And maybe we need a new FDA category. And by the way, this is not official UnitedHealthcare policy. I will say that 6 times, okay? Because we are streaming out here. Subtitle it, please. I've got bosses.
We won't hold you to it, Lynn.
But what if we took that marginal drug, the 4% increment in survival in metastatic disease where the patients are set up, and said, okay, it's got promise. It is now labeled a trial drug. And payers will pay a set fee for that. We'll pay $30,000 for a course of therapy for those trial drugs, only if the patient is enrolled in the next set of clinical trials to begin to explore how it could be used more effectively for the big win. And if you make your 20% or 10% incremental gain something big, then you get full FDA approval, just like you did before. We've got to find a solution that doesn't put us in the Avastin story as opposed to the Herceptin story. Herceptin was a huge win. Somebody mentioned this morning with Avastin breast cancer, the FDA process worked. Look, the drug label's been withdrawn, and I'm reimbursing just as much Avastin for breast cancer today as I was 2 years ago. It didn't work. We're still using it, even though we know the drug doesn't prolong survival or have true benefit in breast cancer. So we need to figure out a different approach to find that big win and yet preserve innovation. Because I fully agree with panelists who said, the first time out we may not see a big change, but it's promising. And if that's the case, let's figure out a way to keep going, but do it in the context of trials. Because today in America, as soon as it's on the market, it goes everywhere, and that data is completely lost to us. So we can't find out where to go next.
You were scooching over there.
Yeah, well, the discussion on trials has sort of deviated my thought here, but so I'm going to come back to that. I think in part what we're struggling with is when you only see 4% improvement in survival, that's a population statistic. What we're here about is try to define that population that actually did survive greater, because their survival was probably greater than the 4%, right?
Right.
I mean, so this is where the precision part, we have to totally redesign clinical trials. I think Laura Esserman's I-SPY trial, adaptive trial design, which is a goal of find the right population that's benefiting in a continuous variable, in a continuous system. And so we have to totally disrupt the way we're doing clinical trial design. Even the terminology and endpoints we're using are inappropriate for this day and age, at least where we want to go, and defining those populations that do benefit, because that's really what we're talking about. It's hard to talk about value without, at some point, bringing in evidence. Because even in the context of the story you gave about the individual with advanced prostate cancer, whose value was to live long enough to see a child graduate. Well, that's a desire, but unfortunately, the evidence doesn't back it. And I'm not sure of the nuance of everything, but you can see where I'm going. And now we're talking about evidence and expectation. We have to be honest. Here's what the evidence says for this population as we know it. And that evidence is not good for colorectal cancer. You educated a family, and you did them a great good because you changed their expectation, and now this individual is going to meet some needs that they would not have even been able to do if they thought their expectation was they were going to be cured.
Right.
So this individual now is doing things they want to do. That's a value.
I should say, so you're saying that sometimes the value is in not treating.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a little bit of a paradigm shift for us.
It's an evidence and expectation. Evidence needs to inform expectation. And that's our job. You ask about what do clinicians do. We educate as well. We educate and learn. But if we don't educate and inform in an evidence-based manner, which we have to come back to, personalized medicine in its essence is based on evidence. And we've got to create a system that creates evidence for given populations. And on and on. But at some point, we have to deal with evidence and expectation. They go hand in hand.
Al, do you have it?
Well, there were several points that I think are important. Getting to Lee's thoughts, you know, we're struggling in the United States with clinical trials accrual, and the fear is our accrual rates are going to go lower, certainly not higher. And what we've observed just coming from the ASCO meetings is the number of overseas clinical trials populations. And part of that reflects that agents may be registered in a country, but people don't have access, and their only access is through clinical trials. In our country, as Lee mentioned, a drug becomes available, and we've seen that over and over again, where there may be high interest in the drug, great participation, then it's commercial, and our efforts to further study fall off. And so in thinking about how we can support our efforts to enhance personalized medicine, evaluating tumor biology, entering patients on trials, I would see this as necessitating a partnership with insurers, with the government, with our various enterprises that conduct clinical research to support this effort. And I would be very much in favor. I think having learned from the bone marrow transplant fiasco in breast cancer is that if you really have patients participate, insurers pay for that participation, you'll get your answer much more rapidly. The other point about value is, I was just thinking about this. I have a patient with colon cancer. I'm a GI medical oncologist who I first saw in 2008, presented with metastatic disease. We elected not to do surgery. She had a colonic stent placed and actually entered a clinical trial and has been on several trials. This is in 2008. She just now is going into hospice. She's expended all of her options. But we never saw that before with colon cancer. And if you ask her what was that value, she could work, she could care for her family, she tolerated her therapy well, she was completely functional. Now in 2008, I would have no idea that this would happen. There's no way to predict that this individual would respond to multiple different regimens. And how we get closer to that, and how do we actually measure the value of productivity to society, caring for your family. And so much of the discussion about costs focuses on the cost of a given drug or the scans and so forth. But how do we, as a society, integrate all of these very important factors that have an impact on our on our financial infrastructure of the country also.
So can I just follow up on that a second? Because I think it's sort of a follow-up, but I think that we're talking about value and we're also talking about values. So when because what happens when you're making all these decisions is that the values of the multiple people that are involved around this patient, if we're talking about one person, come into place. So there's the values, I mean, as Bill's speaking about the way that he interacts with his patients and the values and the evidence, that is, I mean, that's something that I personally, my values relate to. It's very humanistic, it's very direct, it's very honest. But then there are, you may be treated by somebody whose values are that you do the absolute most that you could possibly do. You don't look at quality of life. You may have family members pressuring to do more treatment because they want, because that's what's important to them, even regardless of the value of the patient. I'm sure most of us have seen that happen. And then you have the patient's values, which also change from day to day, from time to time. And as somebody goes through the years or months or decades or whatever their survivorship is from this diagnosis, they also change their perception. So there's value, and then there are values, and they interact in a very complex, very nuanced way.
I mean, it truly is complex, and I don't think that we can get to some, underlying beautiful definition that we can all agree on, and I see that. But at the same time, we're still in this position. We have to decide, both from an industry perspective, a decision has to be made which products you're going to pursue to bring to market, and from a payer's perspective, there still has to be some way to evaluate. So we need something. So what at least is palatable to for making those decisions? I mean, we here in the U.S. don't use a cost per quality. That's really a very hard measure. Where do we go? How do you grapple with these issues?
We don't use it only because we aren't facing reality yet. So we're going to have to. Let me throw out two alternatives, and I certainly wish that in my training the last year had been seminary and then situational ethics after the oncology fellowship. So keep it in mind for training now. On one hand, we could simply set a bright line, as you just suggested. So here's a high performer. This is a drug that gets 20% more cures, 20% increase in length of survival, whatever the measure is, but a high bar, and agree that we pay for those, but we quit paying for all the others. Now, in today's world, a lot of drugs would drop out under that scenario, and I think, has already been said here, we may lose some potential for learning more about those drugs in the future, but that's one approach. The other approach would be to say, look, UnitedHealthcare spends $120,000 on a prostate cancer patient during his lifetime. Here's your $120,000. Now you and your clinician get to decide with your value system how you want to spend that for your care. Another option. But it would allow a big system that has to be fairly structured to drive the decisions down to the individual, where they could make it based on values that are very important to them. And they may say, I am perfectly willing to spend that whole enchilada on the next new drug out, or nope, I'm going to piece that out in small, commonly used, not quite as effective drugs and see how much time I get. The options are huge, but it would require discussion between the patient and the attending physician that young man I talked about never got, because they didn't tell him he was terminal. They avoided that topic. All three of his clinicians did. But when you walk in and say, look, I've got $120,000 here, tell me what I can buy with that, it's a whole different discussion. So that may be one way to get to value. Either one isn't perfect, and I can't think of anything that's going to make every constituency happy. I just can't do it.
No, I agree with you, and I want to step back to something that Richard had said earlier, and that's that when products come to market, we don't always know their value. We don't know it right away, and yet we tend to evaluate right away. So where do we take that, Richard?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing just to say, when you look at the healthcare and what's value, one of the big problems, and came up in the earlier session, is things are so fragmented. There's, and every, surgeons, and then, imaging and, all these different groups, have, their own view. So one thing that's going to have to happen, to me, is going to be more collaboration and dialogue. And there's no one who has the answer. And I think whether it's industry or payers or the medical community, that's going to happen. I think the other thing, that I actually have a pretty strong belief in is I do think, technology can either make things, more expensive or make things less expensive. But now you have phones, you can get your blood tests, you're eventually going to be able to get your genome and your medical records and stuff. And I think with a lot of dialogue and technology and improved diagnosis, there are a lot of things in the system that are going to help drive down cost, I think. And the question is when and how long. And
When am I going to see
yeah,
that?
when are you going
Right.
to see it? And it's not happened, but
Right.
will that happen in treating the right patient? So I think there's some things, on the horizon, but the question is we're going to have to develop, I think, in partnership, a time frame, some standards for things like biomarkers, some standards for outcomes, for medical records, how we're going to use this material, and that's the thing that's not missing. And the question is who's going to be the person or the entity that's going to really drive that? And at this point, I don't know.
I think, again, patients want to share information. You heard Kathy Giusti talk about Facebook and identifying each other on Translation 414. I mean, they want to know. And I think we need to take lessons from that. So it's our job, frankly, to create a system as well that creates a structure to follow as many people as possible throughout their lifetime, not just when they're getting therapy, but throughout. You asked about how do we know drugs are approved, but we don't know their true efficacy, their true value. In part because we don't follow those patients. Once it's approved, it's approved. We
Right.
stop.
Data's
We
lost.
can't do that. We can't even integrate the therapy into the standard of care without knowing where it fits. And the only way you're going to know where it fits is you follow patients throughout their lifetime. Patients want you to do that. We have created a system called Total Cancer Care that does exactly that. It asks permission to follow patients throughout their lifetime. Over 90% say yes, we'd like you to do that. So they become cancer information donors. They donate their tumor. And oh, by the way, if you find something, they'd like to be recontacted. That is something that we can do, and patients want you to do. And ultimately, by doing that, we're going to find where does the benefit reside, where does this therapy fit into the standard of care based on the evidence. And there are many, many challenges and many, many bottlenecks in approaching something like that. But I think I heard Laura or maybe Kathy or someone said, just do it. Just get started. And then you'll probably find challenges you never anticipated. But maybe some of those challenges weren't actually as big as you thought they might be. So, we are at a good point, I think. We now have the capability and desire from patients to follow. They want us to learn from them, hopefully to their benefit as well. But it's amazing the altruism of the population and the patients themselves. They want you to learn, and they want you to be able to use what you learn for the future generations. So that in itself is value. Giving patients the opportunity to be followed so that you can learn from them is of value.
But you have a meaningful engagement with them, and I think you have a meaningful engagement that allows people, brings out the best on all sides of it, and I think that's a really important part of this. And I may be a really good patient advocate, I think I am, but I'm a really lousy former patient because I was at Cedars-Sinai and they send me this questionnaire every year, but they don't ask me any questions that are meaningful to me. How are you? When did you have your last physical? Not how has this affect, how is your, they don't ask me about my psychosocial status, they don't ask me about fertility issues, they don't ask me about family. So you're engaging people in a meaningful way where you are doing something of benefit to them and they derive benefit out of it for themselves or for society, because I think you're right. I think people are generally altruistic. So one of the questions I had from the last panel, and we heard incredible models of really important things, and Kathy just started to bring it up, but we didn't take it much further, is how do we replicate all of this meaningful engagement around these questions? So Moffitt Total Cancer Care is a great model. Multiple Myeloma Foundation is a great model. I Spy is a great model. And I think one answer is we just do it, but I think we also have to spend some time thinking about what are the models that work and how we get them out there.
That's right.
And what keeps people engaged. And I think
right.
it is it's meaning.
What those models have in common, though, is a very strong-willed woman. Basically, Laura and Kathy are the most altruistic dictators I've ever met. But they made that happen by sheer force. Now, collaboration is so important. It's got to happen. I think Al's mentioned, I agree with that fully. But it takes a Kathy and a Laura to beat somebody to collaboration. Once she gets her nucleus group going, it does fall forward. But I've been impressed that no one's going to move from their current position until somebody forces them to, and that's what Kathleen and Laura have done very well. So the more champions we have like that, the faster this process moves.
So what I'm hearing, this is what I heard from out of the first panel, and I have to say I'm excited about it, and you guys are actually saying the same thing, as I'm pushing you on definitions and how do we do this and that, and you all keep coming back to the same issue, that it's about the data. We don't have the data that we need. You're not even willing to really answer my questions on value. You keep skirting it because you want to keep coming back to this data issue. So I say let's just stay there for a little bit because it's clearly where you want to be, and I really think that it's a place that we do need to be, is where are we getting this data? You know, and how are we working together? And I think the examples that you're all throwing out there, I think they're wonderful examples. They are different models. So the question is, right, how do we replicate? What do we do? Are we treating all of the cancers separately? You know, do they have their own, you know, their own little groups? I mean, how do we, that's helpful to some regard, but it's not ultimately, you know, helpful in the end. So how do we start to take these initiatives and push them forward? How are we going to generate this collaboration?
So I'll start with what we are doing. For the last 3 years, we've been collecting clinical information on patients that's, compared to the Moffitt, is absolutely elementary. It's what's the tumor, what's the stage, give me the genetic information, it's basic HER2, KRAS, et cetera. And what's this patient's current status? Are they in adjuvant therapy in remission, or have they relapsed? With that, we combine it with all the claims data. And we can see now what treatments they're getting or not getting, what kinds of complications they had, and so on. And next year, we will begin rolling out that process nationally so that it's mandatory if you want coverage. Your physician will have to call in, give that data, and then we will approve the coverage from there. That will give us enough data to start doing some comparative effectiveness research and cost comparisons. And from that data, as we start to see certain treatments get better results or cost less and get the same results, we will start to prefer those treatments. The benefits will be better for treatments that are getting better results. Patients will have to pay more for those that are getting less benefit results. That is, for us, going to start in a big way next year and probably should be rolling within 3 to 4 years nationally. To give you an idea of what we're doing, now we would welcome the opportunity to combine data with anyone, to offer that data to researchers for their use. So I think there are plenty of things we can do. Well, we're already doing it, believe it or not, in Ohio. We sat down with our most fierce competitor, the WellPoint Group, and the two of us gave all of our claims data to an academic investigator who combined it with tumor registry to figure out how care was being given in the state of Ohio. I would have never guessed that we would ever cooperate with WellPoint. And at that point, I put on my Laura and Kathy hat, and we just hammered it out. It can be done. That's my only point with that story.
It can be done. Al, you were talking earlier and very focused on clinical trials, and what Lee is talking about is moving pieces together into claims data to help broaden our data perspective. And is there a tension there, or are they complementary?
Well, I think they can be complementary, but one of the challenges here in terms of data acquisition is how do we achieve this at the practice level? So even though I would support what Lee is trying to do in gathering data, at my center that comes at even more expense. I mean, we have spent tens of millions of dollars on infrastructure at Northwestern. We're completely electronic with our medical records. But that has also resulted in hiring many, many more people to support that infrastructure. And the demands we have daily for data is just accelerating, whether it's our clinical trials or pre-certification, or, you know, the momentum is such that it's one thing if you're a big center like I'm in, but what if you're a small hospital system or a private practice with 5 practitioners. Already we hear, you know, with smaller practices, they look at the bill for the electronic medical record and ask, how are we going to afford it? Because it's not only the expense of purchase and setting it up, it has to be maintained. And then how do we get it to link to other people that our practice must interact with, such as a hospital or another practice of surgeons or an independent radiology group. So part of this discussion about data is how do we move this at the top of the list to make the type of investment we need. And this investment is going to become even more crucial as we start looking at subsets of patients and needing to have in larger population sets the genomic data, individual marker data, survivorship data. That all comes at enormous expense at the practice level, and that's where we're going to have to generate these data. And we've got to address the infrastructure that is costing all of us a great deal of money currently, and it's only accelerating.
Just, you know, a comment, and I think, you know, this is, you know, a good way to start, but the question is for data, you know, that you're going to collect just on large populations, there's so much chance to introduce bias. So I think the claim forms are probably going to be different if you went to Tampa than if you went to Montana or something. I mean, that would be my guess, that there's going to be different practice patterns and different populations and things. And, you know, then there's the other thing is if someone, you know, enters their data or their claims and they move to another zip code, they may be seen as lost or dead and lost to follow-up. So I think it's something that's going to have to be done, but I think, you know, really looking at this data and really being sure that you don't put any biases and that you control for a lot of the, you know, different things that can really bias the data and the outcomes.
So, just by the way, we've solved for every one of those that you mentioned. But my point is, we have to do something and move. So it will not be perfect. We agree on that. But it might be good enough. So I kind of compare it to the difference between quantitative chemistry and organic chemistry. In organic, you just got to throw things in a tube, and over here in quantity, you really had to measure it. We've got to make some decisions, and we have to find at least enough information to point us in a general direction. And we can sit on these panels all day, but we've got to start doing something.
But it does come back down to value for those. We're talking about acquisition of data, aggregation of data that we value to do what we want to do. But depending on the stakeholder, even depending on the type of physician, it's, you're asking for different data. What we found, for example, is we're trying to create this common data elements that we were collecting that would meet most of the needs. And what we got was some significant pushback. Well, you're not asking the right questions. Why do I have to participate in something that's not going to help me? So this is what we wound up doing, is saying, all right, what is germane to every patient, whether they have a hematologic malignancy, a colorectal cancer, whatever. Let's start with that, because you're all going to get some benefit from that. And so slow buy-in, but eventual buy-in. And then we called that our hub. That's our hub data. And now hematologic malignancies, they start telling us this is what we data need. And so you create a spoke so that it interacts with a system. And the same was true for even patient self-reporting data. We thought that would be, actually, the genesis of that, we weren't doing that in the beginning. We created a patient advocacy and ethics council to help us. And one of the questions we asked was, what can we give back to every patient? Not just those that might need the data to help them for therapy, but everybody. They said, give us back our data without hesitation. Give us back our data in a meaningful way that we can actually use, which was the birth of the patient portal. And it wasn't just those that consented to be followed. We decided to do it for everybody. Now, those that consent to be followed have a separate page within their portal that says, you know, the total cancer care, where they can look at their consent form, they can visit it, they can ask questions, those sort of things. It's one of the most popular things we've ever done. But something we embedded in that, we saw this as an opportunity to ask patients questions and get patient self-reported data. The pushback we initially got on the physicians was, you're going to take up time, you're going to mess up my clinic. They're going to be filling out this bloody questionnaire, which, by the way, does take 45 minutes to do, so it was not trivial. But we developed a system so that they can do it over the internet and actually do it before their first visit. Oh, well, now it's starting to be cool because it's a 350-question questionnaire, 27 questions on just tobacco use, and, by the way, built with patient advocates telling us what they want to be asked, and molecular epidemiologists, psychologists, eventually getting this thing done. And the docs saw, wait a minute, this is actually very valuable. I can shorten the time that I'm actually taking all this history, and I'll validate what I think needs to be, and now it's part of the electronic medical record. What started off as a research tool through the internet and trying to give something back to patients now became a very valuable tool for the physicians. But that was a journey. I just described what took about 3.5 years to get to that point. But so it can be done. It does require a great deal of input back to value of not only the value, obviously, of the physician, but the type of physician. And to break down the silos, you've got to give something back. You've got to give something that's germane and they see value in. So I'm going to come back to the value.
I think we could easily, me personally, we could keep doing this for another hour and a half, but we're going to have to wrap up, unfortunately. So, and I know hopefully there'll be some questions from the audience, but before we wrap up, I would really like if each of you could just tell us in a few words, what is it we should do tomorrow? When we walk out of here, I mean, we've had this great conversation. We've really identifying what it is we're not willing to hardcore define yet because we don't have the data that we need. We're putting cost on the table. We know it's an issue. We still don't know what to do about it. Where do we go tomorrow? What is the first thing that we should do coming out of here? Who should we call, or what policy needs to be addressed, or what collaborations need to happen? Just whatever is for each of you. Gwen, if you want to start.
Well, of course, you'll know, you can probably guess what I'm going to say, but I think before I do say what you've all guessed I'm going to say, I would like to go back to the first panel and really build on something that Len Lichtenfeld said, which I think is really critical that we don't lose sight of, which is we're talking about building value, but we have to be able to have the means to deliver this value to people that are diagnosed with cancer, the entire universe of people that are diagnosed with cancer, and I think that's something we can't lose sight of. And the woman who spoke from Augusta, Georgia, about the different, because there are also regional differences about bringing in public health and people that are educators. I think this is a critical component of this conversation, and I know people are doing it in their various centers and various things that they do, but I just want to make sure that that's explicit as opposed to something that is just assumed, because I don't think we can assume that. And so, clearly to me, one of the most important things to do is to bring in is to make sure that all of the dimensions and the facets of people that are involved in cancer care and the voices are all brought to the table. And so, to me, of course, I would think that a very important thing is to have many discussions with a range of people, of patient voices, on what is value to them, and to be able to be open. I mean, I think one of the issues that we see is that there's not a lot of tolerance for critical discussions, and there's not a lot of tolerance for disagreement, but because it's seen as negative. But a critical discussion with multiple points of view can be one of the richest and most productive discussions that you can have, as long as you're open to the differing points of view.
Great. Richard?
Well, I think, increase in continued dialogue and figuring out what data we really need to collect and how we'll use the data and what's the benefit to patients is critical. Second thing is some further standardization in terms of biomarkers, data collection, and outcomes. I think and third, a way to sustain innovation, because I think through innovation, I think patients will benefit, and I think society will benefit, and just thinking, we've talked a lot on the cost side, but keeping people alive for years and letting them be productive members of society, I think is really something that's really important, something we need to continue to remember.
Absolutely. Lee, do you want to?
Well, if I had a magic wand, I'd say that tomorrow you have to fill out a 5 choices form before you can get your first treatment for metastatic cancer. You can see the form on the internet. It forces a valued discussion with the patient and the clinician. So I think if we could do that as an absolute mandatory step, we'd move this field 2 miles forward. My second action step would be that a congressional committee gets convened to talk about how much can we pay for a year of life in cancer therapy. That at least we start the discussion at a national level. It would be an interesting one, to say the least, but we need to start.
Great. Bill?
Well, I think it comes down to priority, and I think ultimately it's evidence. I think when you start generating evidence of what's actually working for whom, we probably don't need a congressional committee because we'll have evidence of what's working. And so I think that's the highest priority. Well, how do we create evidence? Well, then you have to follow as many patients as possible with not only data, but accurate data, and throughout their journey. And so I think the emphasis would be, how do we engage? How do we make a patient accessible to what we're talking about and contributing to this in Augusta, Georgia? Then you build a system that invites every patient to participate. And so we're going to have to change a lot of the way we do things. The other thing we learned in this patient advocacy is, why are we having to go through a doctor referral to enter this? You're asking if you can follow us. Why don't you just ask us? And do it through the internet, by the way. And so we're looking into that. So create an accessible means of allowing patients to donate their information, which I think ultimately will create an evidence-based system, which with that, then we're going to be far wiser about how we spend our dollar for healthcare. Without evidence, we're going to continuously have this, well, it didn't work for him, but it could work for me. And evidence is the key.
Okay. Al?
Well, since no one group is going to solve our enormous issues here, I think it's just mandatory we break down the barriers of communication, that we uniformly bring all involved in this debate constantly with the goal to articulate what do we need in this country to advance our goals for really effective therapy. And those discussions are going to include, how do we generate an effective, efficient database system, because that's going to drive a great deal in how we determine what is effective and, in fact, how we advance medicine. But also to begin a dialogue and to break down these barriers and get away from concepts like death panels and begin to have meaningful discussions with patients and the medical community about what is truly appropriate care, integrating concepts of palliative care and end of life that will be essential if we're going to start containing costs, because these areas are constantly identified as high-ticket items, and also unfair to patients, offering inappropriate interventions that will not be helpful. And without a national forum where people are willing to sit down and have these very difficult discussions, I think we're going to be in the same situation of spinning our wheels.
Thanks. Well, you all have done a fantastic job, because we have a line here of questions, so you definitely energized our audience. So please go ahead.
Great. Cullen Hill, GNS Healthcare. So the discussion focused on the creation of evidence at scale from data and creating that evidence faster. it's becoming clear to me and to others that the only way we're going to do that is to be able to learn this evidence from observational data as opposed to from only randomized controlled clinical trials, which take a long time, they're expensive, and they don't give us the numbers of patients. We've seen this kind of learning happen in other places like e-commerce and online advertising. Amazon.com is better set up for giving recommendations based on what people buy than what we have now in healthcare. And of course, our problems are special. There have been advances in analytics that can extract this causality, not just correlation from data, but I'm curious to hear from the panel what you see of the path forward for us to create this evidence at scale. And it's not just the data is the start, but lots of data by itself doesn't solve the problem, and analytics that just give us patterns are also not enough. So I'd be curious to hear what's happening at United and Lilly and Moffitt and other places.
So ours is unfortunately observational, but what we'd love to see is about 200 I spies out there that basically get you to not worrying about the randomized trial, but getting out there and taking a very rapid snapshot. What do you take, 20 patients or so, Lauren, before we go on to the next phase 2? That kind of progress can be done and done quickly and statistically valid. So that's unfortunately beyond our scope. We just pay claims, occasionally look at them from time to time. But there are ways to do that, and I think that's probably the best approach to getting data without having to struggle through the randomized trial. We're going to have to change our trial structure, and we're going to have to get more people involved in it, because that's where we've learned everything we know.
You know, a lot of our focus is on randomized trials, and we're doing some observational trials. But again, the amount of data we're collecting, especially in terms of this genetic sphere and really trying to understand which patients may benefit and not, the informatics that we're using to try to do that, and the correlation with all the clinical data, big way we're trying to do it to really define which patients are going to benefit. And informatics is a key to being able to do that.
You know, I think I'm a fan of observational studies, obviously, but I think importantly they inform us that we're not going to dispense with randomized clinical trials. What we want to do is be smarter about doing randomized clinical trials. Do a go, no-go feasibility sort of testing based on the evidence at hand. Is this a right trial to do? Well, we'll be far more informed when we're following millions of patients and getting data that is saying there is a correlation here. So it becomes a hypothesis generator. We're far more informed about which trials we're doing, which should reduce the cost of drug discovery, which hopefully would reduce the cost of drugs ultimately. And so I think discovery and frankly, delivery is a continuum, and they inform each other. So I think there's no only do observational studies, don't do randomized clinical trials. That's not going to work. But if you're smart and you're informed, then you're much smarter in designing those trials.
Hi, Mike Miller, a medical policy consultant. We want to drill down a little bit and talk more about quality metrics or measurements, because as we move forward, paying less for specific therapies and more in this accountable care world or capitation or shared savings, the onus is going to be on measuring the quality of care for a delivery system. We've got very good measures for A1C, blood pressure, LDL, cholesterol, those kinds of specific things. But for oncology, particularly because there's a very wide variability of what the goals are for the patients, how do we go ahead and measure an organization's quality of care for oncology? I like the hub and spoke model, but I think it's far behind where we are for a lot of other chronic diseases like diabetes, blood pressure. So we can comment, I think, quickly on some of the concepts about quality measurement for a delivery system as opposed to sort of this mortality for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Thank you.
So, if you don't mind, we started a episode pilot group about 2.5 years ago with 5 large oncology groups. They all have 15 partners or more. And with that same simple one-page sheet, stage, the diagnosis, the histology, the genetic information, current status, combined with claims data, We've now created 72 measures of performance for those oncology practices, which they reviewed this February. And that goes from survival, the time to progression after first relapse with metastatic disease, number of hospitalizations, number of emergency room visits, overusage of colony granulin stimulating factors, underusage of the same drug. The measures go on and on and on. And I think it's very easy with a claims data set to start profiling the true performance of a practice with just basically combining claims data and a relatively small amount of clinical information.
Does that take into account how one patient wants to see their grandchild's, graduation from college, yet another one wants to maintain their ability to finish their book?
Well, you asked me to look at the practice, not the one patient, and I just gave you aggregate practice data. So beneath every one of those measures is the actual claims data set. One of the groups had a huge expense for metastatic breast cancer, way off the charts. We broke it down. It was one patient who left their practice to go to a tertiary care center. So yeah, it's capable, we can do that. But we're still looking at group performance in general, not letting the outliers dominate it. Those groups, of the 5 groups when we looked at the data, each one went home with a significant deficit they felt they could address and improve from that conference.
I think 2 things need to be, I think quality is obviously extremely important, but there are 2 major variables that have to be considered. One, are you studying the same patient population for quality? So there's a cohort identity that you have to perform. What are the outcomes given this patient population phenotypically and genotypically? So if you're going to measure quality, you have to have a reference point. And the first one is, am I looking at the same patient population at one side vis-a-vis another? The other is creating a reference, create a standard. This is where the evidence says we should be treating to date. And if you vary, did it create worse outcomes or better outcomes? If it created worse outcomes, get back on board, get back on the ship here. If it got better, and it's the same population, and you varied, but this population is doing better, then let's study that.
You have a new standard.
Yeah.
And I think you're also talking about introducing a social science research into this, because you're talking about qualitative and interviews with patients about what their experiences were. And there are some groups out there that are doing that, but they don't tend to be integrated into these measures. So I think that's something to consider. That's something to consider adding into all of this, and something that could work very well with what you're doing at Moffitt.
What I also think is important about quality is, we develop various measures of concordance to practice guidelines, but that's one measure. But you also have to understand where is the variation and why do people not hit these quality indicators, and generating those type of data, because that will help develop education tools and how to improve practice.
Hi, I'm Tim Clark with Sanofi. Excuse me, and I think I'm between us and lunch, so I'll be brief. I want to touch on a point that you made, Dr. Newcomer, and you, Dr. Benson, touched on it. When we talk about establishing the dollar figure for quality of life, we get into a very difficult political conversation. And I think what we saw during the Affordable Care Act, and I worked on it, I have the scars to prove it, was that a very real and honest conversation about end-of-life care can get transformed into death panels. And so what I would urge, and what I think folks who have the guts to have this conversation need, is cover. Cover from academic institutions, cover from patient organizations, to actually have this conversation. I believe that there are members up there who will have this conversation, but they need to be protected, because we have the example of what can happen when you have a very real conversation that needs to happen. Our economic situation is such that we cannot afford this unsustainable path. I agree with you, but there needs to be some level of protection for these members so they can have an open and honest conversation. I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts were to that.
Well, first hit the mute button on Sarah Palin's interview. I think
I'm
it was
not going to be
her turn.
partisan.
Unfortunately, I don't think there is a way to do this without taking some hits. It's a tough subject, and the people that are bold enough to get up and lead it are going to take some shots. But eventually, I think common sense will prevail. The death panel description was absolute politics at its worst. We all know that. People were hurt, and yet they were brave enough to have the discussions. And we're going to have to keep coming back to that time and time again. The alternative is very simple. The healthcare system collapses, and we do it the old-fashioned way with pure rationing, which we do today, but we'll aggravate it even more. So I think we've got to have it. And I'm going to stand right up there and support whoever is leading that discussion and take some shots with them. And I hope that somebody's still standing.
Well, it's my job now to thank the panel. Kathy and all our panelists, thank you so much for your thoughts.